Misuse of Tradition. Joanne is a professor of theology at the Toronto School of Theology, formerly she was a member of theology at the Institute for Studies of Christian Thought, the Institute of Christian Thought rather, and is one of the foremost Canadian theologians. She's been on the CBC many times, written extensively, has worked in both administrative and exclusively teaching functions at the University of Toronto's Department of Religious Studies, and more particularly the Faculty of Theology at St. Michael's College. And she's going to talk about the uneasiness of the church vis-a-vis women, the roles played by women in the church in different eras, and provide a comparison of the church to society along the lines of this particular focus or question. I welcome and introduce to you, and take great pleasure in so doing, Professor Joanne Dewart of the Toronto School of Theology, who is presently actually at the General Theological Seminary in New York on sabbatical and has been kind enough to come up here for our conference. Joanne?
That Higgins is Irish, and Michael is being very Irishly kind, I think, in the way he describes me. I'm extremely happy to be here. I both overlap, obviously, with some of the things that Elizabeth's already said, because you can't talk about this topic and not begin to repeat certain things. But I'm particularly glad that she emphasized and spoke so much about the experience of women in the church, because that gives you flesh to put on the drier bones that I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk a good deal about what should be done with experience and how it should be integrated into the church, into the church life, into the living tradition of the church. So as I say, I'm very glad, among all the other fine things she said that. I also, speaking of as a theologian, perhaps a little more a historical theologian, that is my specialty. And I chose this title for today's seminar because it seems to me that a true appreciation of the church's past tradition and what is called the living tradition, the present spirit-filled life of the church, a true appreciation of this would significantly change the attitude of the Roman Catholic Church to its women members. It is not only that appeal is frequently made to a past that seems tyrannical in its grip on the present. Someone has described this notion of tradition as nothing must ever happen for the first time. But also, and I think more importantly, the present experience of vocation, which Elizabeth spoke about, the present pastoral needs, the present theological scholarship, all these are the formative ingredients of the living tradition, and they're all being ignored. The misuse of tradition that I speak of can be best perceived against a background of a positive understanding of tradition. So let me begin by posing some of the questions which commonly come to our mind when we talk about tradition. First of all, what do Christians, particularly Roman Catholics, because Roman Catholics talk about tradition more than most Christians, what do Christians understand by the term tradition? Does tradition include all the past, everything that's ever happened in the church? Is it the same as revelation? If it isn't the same, what's the relationship between revelation and tradition? How are competing traditions sorted out? And I'll speak to that with an example in a minute. And why has the Catholic Church, both the Eastern Roman Catholic and the Anglican Catholic Church, stressed tradition more than the Protestant churches? And finally, and perhaps the crunch question, how binding is tradition? Now, it is evident that these 6 questions are not going to be exhaustively or even adequately treated in the next half hour or so. But I shall at least try to give a resume of contemporary Roman Catholic thinking on the subject. And I'm going to start with 3 fairly recent quotations. First one dating from 1962, second from 1980, third from 1981. All by Catholics, all by Roman Catholic theologians and I'm glad to give you the sources if you want them. The first, 1962. Tradition is fulfilled when the Church lives in accordance with Christ's message by celebrating baptism and the Eucharist, when it preaches, teaches, and bears witness to that message. Second, 1980. Tradition is that which is to be handed on to the future, which is formulated in fidelity to the Spirit of Christ, using present Christian experience. The third, 1982. True tradition is the continuing presence of Christ through his Spirit in the life of the Church. The kernel of these three definitions, and they are representative of contemporary Roman Catholicism, is that Christ has been and is present to the Church when the Church witnesses in word, sacrament, and practice to his message. Now, while all in some way refer to the past, words like fidelity, continuing, there's always an implicit, if not an explicit, reference to the past. It is clear that the present witness is at least equally important. Secondly, it is clear that tradition does not include all the past. I know of no one who thinks it does, and indeed it would be impossible that it should. And let me give one example to illustrate that, and you could fill in dozens more. For the first few centuries, Christians knew only what we call public ecclesial penance. That is, sins too serious, traditionally the three: murder, adultery, and apostasy. Sins too serious to be forgiven in personal prayer, personal reconciliation with God in that sense, were confessed in front of the community. Penance for them was done in the sight of the community. The penitent stood at the door of the church as people went in and begged forgiveness, things like that, begged their prayers. And finally, sometimes after years, the penitent was reconciled by the bishop in the presence of the community. Now, at some point in the early Middle Ages, what we know as private or auricular penance, private confession to a priest, and equally private absolution, replaced public penance. The Church at that time decided, on the basis of its then-present experience, its current experience, that the gospel injunction to repent and be converted was better fulfilled by private than public penance. The Church today clearly cannot be faithful to both these traditions. Traditions cannot simultaneously be public and private. Penance cannot simultaneously be public and private. But it can be faithful to the Christian tradition of sorrow for past sins and resolve to amend one's life, perhaps by finding an entirely new form of penance, neither of the old forms. Now, I hope that illustration says that we're talking about tradition, which is often written with a capital T, and small letter traditions. And the distinction, as far as I know, was first introduced in 1960 by a French Dominican, Yves Congar. The point is obvious. There are traditions, the little traditions, if you like, e.g. penitential discipline, is it public or private, which exist to serve the tradition, penance itself. As I said, you can think of many, many other examples. All traditions are not equally useful, and they must be constantly monitored, lest, and I'm quoting here, they misrepresent the true tradition, the continuing presence of Christ through the Spirit in the life of the Church. Again, using this criterion, we can think of traditions that have been put aside, or of others perhaps that are ready to be put aside. Tradition, large letter tradition, even in the sense of Christ's continuing presence in the Church, is not revelation. That is, if we understand revelation as the conviction which we find paradigmatically expressed in the New Testament of God's salvation present in the person of Jesus Christ. tradition is the witnessing to and the continuation of that revelation. Our authentic traditions witness to our conviction of that salvation, and they help implement it. They work toward it. Just as tradition, the big T, is served by the traditions, so in turn, tradition itself serves revelation. It is judged by revelation. It does not judge it, and it does not replace it. Theology and piety of all schools unite in telling us that each Christian generation, in fact each Christian, must appropriate this revelation in a very personal way, this conviction of God's salvation in Christ. It is not enough to read about it or to hear about it as an historical event. Each generation must continue the creation of the living tradition by adapting the traditions. The metaphor that comes to my mind is the difference between a house museum and a home. The former, a house museum, we've all been in them. I thought of Dickens in London. I thought of John A. Macdonald's in Kingston. And I believe there's one here, William Lyon Mackenzie King, am I right, in Kitchener? They serve history, I think, very well. You see the kitchen utensils, the pots and pans. You see the baby's crib. You see the clothes hanging up in the wardrobe. And all these make the people of the past very real, and the lives they led very real to us. But these houses are dead. They're static. When you go into them, even the air is still. A home, however, no matter how old the building, no matter how venerable the building, is constantly being repainted, given new carpets, a new furnace, a new roof, as we all know. Never keep up with it. And it changes. A porch is glassed in. The kitchen is modernized. The bedroom we remember as being our aunt's now belongs to our cousin. This sort of thing. But it is precisely, I think, in these changes, in keeping the house a family home that is being constantly renewed, that the tradition of the family is being kept. In other words, change itself is a way of being faithful to the tradition. And so in the church. Faithfulness to the tradition which witnesses to revelation of salvation in Christ, which interprets it and implements it in a variety of ways, is not turning the church into a museum of past traditions. One of the, now seen to have been exaggerated, historical differences between Catholicism and Protestantism has been the insistence of the former that the Scriptures, that is the paradigmatic expression of revelation, must be traditioned by the church in every generation. The Catholic Church historically could not accept sola scriptura. If that is understood in, I think, an unrealistic sense, and also I think a sense that Protestants don't understand it, by the way, in the unrealistic sense of a naked Bible, uninterpreted by the ongoing tradition. Well, then how is revelation traditioned? It's a dreadful verb, but it's the easiest thing to do. How is it renewed for each generation? All the theologians cited earlier speak of present experience. And as I mentioned earlier, Elizabeth has brought that very vividly before us. And for the last decade or so, the theology which arises from praxis, particularly the Latin American liberation theology, has commanded a very wide following. But whose experience, whose praxis, whose theology for that matter, should be normative? How do we test present trends in the church to determine which are genuinely prophetic, creative, but true to the tradition, and how do we discern those that may lead away from it? The problem is obviously not a new one, and the theological battles of the past bear witness to earlier attempts to answer this question in relation to the various dogmas that have evolved. Sometimes, looking back, it seems that certain trends were ruled out too quickly, that perhaps both and would have been a better approach than either or. And again, we could give examples of that. We do have various criteria. We have the overriding one, the most important one, the Scripture, the basic revelation. We have the great creeds. We have past magisterial pronouncements. And we have, and this is I think what is not being paid nearly enough attention to, what they call the sensus fidelium, the living faith of the church. And it is this last today, this living faith, the sensus fidelium, the church community's understanding of its faith, which is drawing the most attention from theologians, partly no doubt because the community as a whole, the faithful, the laity, the non-official church, is seen to have been denied its proper role in the past. Patterns in the church follow patterns in society as a whole. We see the primitive church in Jerusalem reflecting the organization of the Jewish synagogue. The post-Constantinian church exhibited very imperial modes of behavior. The church of the Middle Ages, feudal, and later monarchical in form. In the ecclesial models from Constantine on, the layperson occupied a place roughly parallel to that of the ordinary, non-propertied, non-noble person in secular society. We might wish that the church had challenged social structures more, but with few exceptions it did not. It was a reflection of its age. But that reflection disappeared after the Protestant Reformation. And from the 18th century on, the church has consciously resisted changes that have come about in the wider society. The supreme and almost ludicrous example of that, very often cited, is the one in the Papal Syllabus of 1870, which condemned the notion, and I'm quoting, that the Roman pontiff can and ought to be reconciled to and come to terms with progress, liberalism, and modern civilization. May I say, by the way, that is not by anyone thought to be an infallible statement. But it is indicative. Now, today's church, after 2 centuries of Western democracy, deliberately retains a monarchical model. Elizabeth spoke about that, slightly different language, but this kind of down-from-the-top model. And in keeping with that model, the laity are seen as passive recipients, not the active formulators of the living tradition. And so, the theologians, who on the one hand insist that the sensus fidelium should be considered, on the other realize that normally it is not. Now, oddly, or it seems to us oddly, in the light of our own experience, Christian women were not particularly disadvantaged in the church of the first 19 centuries. And again, Elizabeth has spoken glowingly of the role they played at the very inception. There's an interesting thing which she didn't have time to refer to in one of the Gnostic Gospels, one of the non-canonical Gospels. Peter wants to oust Mary Magdalene from a position she holds. And is said, but, you simply can't. A woman cannot be a leader in the church. And the others rally round and say, but Christ loved her. And he reluctantly backs off. Now, that is, again, not a canonical gospel. But when I say that women were not particularly disadvantaged, what I mean is that their position in the church was not inferior to their position in secular society. They weren't worse off by being Christians, is what I'm trying to say. And sometimes, indeed, it was much better. There has been considerable study of the active role of women in the primitive church. There's huge bibliography on it, again, as I'm sure you know. And fairly solid evidence that they were ordained at least to the diaconate. Maybe more, but at least to the diaconate. Now, even when ecclesial office was denied them, they found scope for their talents and their dedications in the church. And it was a scope that was not available to them in the society outside the church. One need only think of the Mary Wards of the 16th century, the Jean Masse and Marguerite Bourgeois of the 17th, the literally thousands of nursing and teaching sisters who came to North America and took their skills right across the continent. Only the most exceptional women in secular society Florence Nightingale, people like that, had equal opportunities at this time. This picture changed radically in this century. In Western society, to the best of my knowledge, the only social entity which does not recognize the equal status of women is the Roman Catholic Church. Now, I'm speaking of theoretical recognition, not of necessary practice. Practice often, in fact, does lag behind, that we know. Women doctors, women taxi drivers, women lawyers, women engineers, women university professors, as Elizabeth will, I'm sure, endorse, still have to try harder, still have to work harder, as a matter of fact, to attain the same goals. But at least the principle has been conceded. And I would make the same point in terms of the other churches. I know that Elizabeth Kilbourne can tell us that life is not all rosy for an Anglican woman priest. But at least the principle has been conceded. At least the door is open. And that is a tremendous step, the recognition in theory, I think. However, the door in the Roman Catholic Church remains closed, and no amount of the beating of experience and pastoral need has any effect on it. I have said that the official church ignores lay experience generally, but women's experience is ignored. In fact, it's rejected. It's more than ignored, in a particularly stubborn way. We saw it in the Sacred Congregation's Declaration on the Ordination of Women in 1977, in repeated statements of the present Pope, notably the admonition to the American bishops last fall, in various exclusions. Elizabeth mentioned actually the same two examples that I have here, I guess because they're the two most glaring. The attempt to exclude women from teaching in seminaries, and the banning of altar girls, of female acolytes. Most recently, the Archdiocese of Toronto has sent a pastoral letter, which is a classic negative example of the formation of living tradition. 20 years ago, Bernard Lonergan, Canadian Jesuit, a very distinguished theologian, outlined the process of living tradition somewhat like this. At the bottom, certain changes, socio-cultural changes, provoke renewed reflection on Christian revelation. This reflection arising from the new environment, and it bears fruit both in Christian practice and in theological thinking. As I say, the example that we're so much in our minds these days is the Latin American liberation movement. A praxis and a theology that have come along hand in hand, literally, and very frequently by the same people, arising out of a new situation there. Eventually, in the light of this new practice and theology, the official church recognizes in one way or another the latest manifestation of this ongoing life of the Spirit in the church, because that's what it is. This process can be seen to have been at work in the doctrinal developments of the early centuries, and it was something, and this is interesting, very much like this that the Vatican referred to when it promulgated the doctrine of the Assumption in 1950. The encyclical that comes out with that, in about the fourth paragraph, refers to the petitions that have come to Rome and how they were so impressed by the swell of popular feeling that they sent a letter, it's always the plural in the encyclical, asking each bishop to submit his personal opinion on whether this doctrine should be proclaimed. Now, this process that Lonergan describes is obviously an upward, not a downward. And it is a spiral, not a straight line, in the sense that the steps overlap one another. I certainly don't intend to analyze the Toronto pastoral letter in any detail, but I should like to point out how far it is in form from the upward spiral, which arises from the Church's experience and the Church's theology. I shall also, in passing, indicate some of its, seem to me, serious theological defects. The 1977 Declaration, that's the Roman Declaration on the Ordination of Women, was subjected to negative theological criticism almost unparalleled in the history of the Church. The only parallel that comes to my mind is the reaction that was provoked by Humanae Vitae. It is difficult to think of a theologian of stature in Europe or North America. I can say Ronner in Germany, Skilbex in the Netherlands, McCabe in England, Tavard, Cook, Kilmartin, Fiorenza in the United States, David Stanley, who resigned from the Biblical Commission over the issue in Canada. It is difficult to think of a theologian of stature who did not speak out against it, both in its refusal to listen to the church and in the theology it adopted to try to justify its position. The 1984 pastoral has repeated both the declaration's deafness to the experience of the church, and it has built its case on two discredited theological arguments. The anonymous theologian upon whom the pastoral relies sees God. No, I mean that's. As Michael mentioned, I've been on leave this term, so I'm only very slightly in touch with my colleagues in Toronto, but it's, I guess, one of the best guessing games of the theological community. Anyway, this theologian sees God and the world in sexual terms. Sexual differentiation, the pastoral reads, and I'm quoting, is the most entrenched of the qualitative differences experienced in human history. End of quotation. And this human sexual differentiation is taken to be the reflection of a marital relationship within the Trinity. The latter assertion is based on a reading of Genesis 1:27. God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. This reading of Genesis 1:27 is highly idiosyncratic. The usual interpretation of male and female is that in God's image is that God is neither male nor female, but both and more. God embraces and transcends femininity and masculinity. Now, what is objectionable here is not a new metaphor for the Trinity, although to me it seems a poor one, because the Christian Church has been trying for almost 2,000 years to find adequate metaphors for the Trinity, and they all fall short. What is objectionable is the attempt to oppose a metaphor as doctrine and to draw conclusions binding on the Church, not from faith in the Trinity, but from the metaphor which is used to elucidate it. Secondly, the pastoral identifies the Church not primarily and immediately with the risen Christ, an identification that is virtually a theological axiom, but with the new Eve. That is, with the worshiping community as distinguished from, rather than united to, its head, the new Adam. There's that. The relationship is what I'm going to call the disjunctive one. This disjunctive, rather than conjunctive use of the New Testament head-body metaphor, reflects the pastoral stress on sexual differentiation. But it runs counter to the New Testament's emphasis on the unity of Christ with his church. This disjunctive understanding of the metaphor also overlooks the fact that Christ's presence in his church is primarily and basically through his Spirit in the faith of its members, and that Christ's derivative presence in word and sacrament depends on that primary basic presence. The special presence of Christ in the Eucharist is a very special instance of what, again I'm quoting here, but not from the pastoral, of what the community with its leadership does to express its faith. That is, the community is formed through the life of the Spirit of Christ in its members, and the community then expresses its life in word and sacrament. This is what I'm calling the conjunctive model. Now, the function of the priest in this understanding of the Church is therefore to represent the risen Christ present in the community, to be a transparency. A word I'm taking, very distinguished theologian, Edward Kilmartin, a Jesuit at Notre Dame. To be a transparency offering the Eucharist on its behalf. The criterion for priesthood in this ecclesiological model focuses on the fittingness of the person to represent the community, and Kilmartin and many others argue that therefore it demands the inclusion of women. The pastoral, however, by understanding Christ as head vis-a-vis the church, not as one with the church, but the pastoral certainly wouldn't remove Christ from the church, but there's a what I can only call a vis-a-vis relationship, a disjunctive relationship set up. That is, as distinguished from, rather than one with, sets up a different ideal of Eucharist and a different ideal of priesthood. The Eucharist in the pastoral's theology is understood not primarily as the co-accomplishment of the sacrifice of the cross in and by the church, but the Eucharist is seen as initiating and constituting the church. And incidentally, a very strange statement I find, as its only link with God. The church, therefore, flows from the Eucharist, rather than the Eucharist flowing from the church. This ecclesiological model relegates to second place the New Testament's identification of the beginnings of the church with the gift of the Spirit. Pentecost is not mentioned in the pastoral. It ignores the long tradition that the life of the church is the life of the Spirit, and that all valid ecclesial actions, including the act of Eucharistic worship, flow from that life. The pastoral, consistent within its own logic, talks about the gift of the Spirit as a function of the Eucharist. Now, on these two bases, the sexual structure of God and creation, and the distinction of the priesthood from the church as a whole, the pastoral constructs a Eucharistic theology of marital relationship between Christ and the church, between the new Adam and the new Eve. And because the priest represents Christ in this marital Eucharist, masculinity is an essential qualification for priesthood. I'm quoting now from the pastoral. No, I beg your pardon, I'm not. I'm quoting from a criticism that was made of a similar argument in the 1977 Declaration. Someone pointed out there a man by the name of, it'll come, it's in my notes if I need it anyway, a distinguished American Catholic theologian, pointed out that the application of sexual symbolism, of sexual sacramentality, to the I beg your pardon, I'm confusing you. This is a quotation from the pastoral. The application of sexual symbolism, of sexual sacramentality, to the understanding of priestly orders is intrinsic to the sacrament. That's the pastoral's argument. Sexuality is intrinsic to the sacrament, therefore only a man can represent Christ. It should be noted that when this same line of argumentation, although much less embellished, was used in the 1977 Declaration, a commentary pointed out, and this is what I was trying to remember a minute ago, that, and I quote, in the New Testament, the image of Christ as bridegroom, the church as bride, is used only of Christ and is never extended into the area of ministry. In other words, what purports to be a New Testament argument has been extended beyond New Testament use. Now, as a necessary corollary, the pastoral identifies true worship with femininity. Elizabeth made that point in another context. And the following rather long quotation sums up its argument. The qualitative differentiation of men and women is sacramental and liturgical. It is integral to the worship by which the church is constituted as the body, the bride of Christ. The marital structure of the church as bride of Christ is intelligible only upon the presupposition that masculinity and femininity are thus distinct. When the distinction is denied, the intrinsic structure of the Eucharist is no longer marital, no longer the union in the one flesh of the Christus totus. As I say, I've been out of touch with Toronto, but I did hear enough to know that various people are saying in that case all men should be ordained. I mean, the logic of it is that if the head can only be represented by a man, because that's the masculine part of the marital image of the Eucharist, then the worshippers must be represented only by women. But it doesn't take its logic to that extent. The pastoral, it should be pointed out, uses the nuptial image of Christ in the church, not only in a way foreign to the New Testament and to responsible contemporary theology, but also in defiance of the nature of metaphorical language. It is one thing to use a human metaphor to make real and vivid a perception of a religious truth. For instance, when we say that Christ on his exaltation is put at the right hand of God, it's a vivid image. It is quite another to try to constrain divinity within the human metaphor, and therefore to argue that God must have a right hand. I once had a student who tried. That's why that image came so quickly to me. The New Testament nuptial metaphor, interwoven with the head-body metaphor, expresses, when it's not being used in other contexts, expresses clearly and well the oneness of the risen Christ with his church. But to take these metaphors and to apply them disjunctively and literally in an attempt to tailor Christ's relationship with his church so that the Eucharist must be understood in marital terms and the priesthood must therefore be male, is to destroy, among other things, the very nature of metaphor. Now, one last comment on the ecclesiology of the pastoral. It is interesting that, perhaps realizing the weakness of its theological arguments, I don't know, its final appeal against the ordination of women is still to authority. Now, this in itself is, of course, not new, but the implicit logic is, we are told that because the priest represents Christ, only Christ can decide who may be a priest. Now, most of us, if we identify the risen Christ with the Spirit-filled life of the church, we say, well, this in fact is what happens. The church does make the decision. We will also probably say that we think the decision-making mechanisms are seriously deficient. But we would basically see the priest coming from the church making that decision. The pastoral, however, locates the decision-making power not within the church as a whole, that is the community, but with ecclesial authority. And in a very startling, to me, way, makes then a special identification of Christ with the church's hierarchy, rather than Christ as the church as a whole. I say that is an implicit identification, but it's a very, very clear one. I said earlier that the Toronto Pastoral is a classic negative example of the formulation of living tradition, an implicit denial of the presence of the Spirit in the life of the church. Let me conclude by trying to summarize some of what I've said. In the pastoral, to begin with, the starting point, that foundation level of Lonergan's spiral, has been ignored. That is, the experience of the church and the theological reflection upon that experience. Because both the experience of the church and the theological reflection on that experience is at least 75%, I think, in favor of the ordination of women, certainly in the Western world. The crying need of the church for more priests, the lack of which results in some areas in infrequent Eucharists and in others in terribly overcrowded Eucharists, is not attended to. And the conviction of many women that they are called to priestly ministry is rebuffed. May I say that, like Elizabeth, I do not feel myself to be called. This is not a personal plea, but I have many friends who do. I remind you of how involved many women are today in every other aspect of ministry. And again, a point that Elizabeth made, and how artificial and disruptive to the relationships established in those ministries is the importation of a mass priest, if you call it that. And incidentally, many of the priests themselves are very unhappy. I've had friends who say they're embarrassed to go into situations like that, but do because it's the only way for the sacrament to be effective. It is an embarrassing position to put them in. Secondly, the historical tradition of the church is brushed aside as unimportant by the pastoral. And historical scholarship is told it should submit to what is called, and I quote, the truth of the Eucharistic anamnesis. Now, I'm a historian, I don't know what that means. I don't know what they... I know the end they want to achieve, but I don't know how that argument can be advanced. But it's the context is an apparent realization that the historical ground on which they're standing is very shaky. And so there is a paragraph on pages 47 to 48, 2 paragraphs devoted to saying we don't consider ourselves subject to historical investigation. Thirdly, in a parallel fashion, the best of contemporary Roman Catholic theological scholarship, the opinion of a large majority of conscientious and well-trained women and men from many countries has been ignored in favor of a highly idiosyncratic approach to Eucharistic priesthood. The pastoral's use of this theology gives the strong impression of shopping around in search of an argument that would reinforce a position already decided on. This is, as a theologian, again, I'm sure I speak for Elizabeth, I find so galling to trump up an already taken position with this kind of theology. This attitude to historical and theological scholarship runs directly counter to the second stage of the spiral, that is, the scholarly evaluation of Christian experience arising from the new situation. There's an old saying, I don't know if it's familiar to you, it's one I used to hear my grandmother say, about going through the woods and picking up a stick. Well, the pastoral, its eyes carefully averted from the woods of Christian experience and Christian scholarship, has, I think, picked up a very weak stick. Thank you. Yes, at the very back.
I don't think I'm going to make any granted for what I have to say, but I do feel it's a point of view that should be expressed. I'm a Catholic male who supports the Holy See and supports the Catholic statements on the possibility of ordaining women in the church. And I find what's happening here today very distressing. I don't think that the opposite viewpoint has been presented at all in a fair way. I find it very distressing when people ask, when the reasons are laughed at for why women are not ordained in the church, the statements that are made by the leaders of our church are laughed at, and in their writings.
Well, I would invite you to make the case.
Well, I don't feel it's fair to ask me to do that on the moment when I haven't had a chance to prepare like the others have. But if I may continue, I feel that a man as great as our present Holy Father, who is obviously inspired by the Holy Spirit, and who has done so many great things for our church, would not shrug off such an issue, an important issue as this. I feel that men in the church, the leadership of the church, are gravely concerned, or perhaps as gravely concerned with this issue as are the lay woman. And perhaps there will come a time when women will be ordained in the church, and perhaps there will become a time when they should be ordained. One point which has not been brought up today, and something you did refer to when you said 75% of the church, or
whatever the figure, yeah,
of the ordination of women, and then you went on to say at least in the Western church. One issue that has to be addressed is the position of other cultures. We are a universal church, as was pointed out earlier this morning, and we must consider other cultures that are perhaps not as open to the position or the idea of women in positions of leadership as is our own culture.
May I speak to that one? May I speak to that? And then go on. This is not a matter of doctrine. This is a matter of discipline. And discipline can vary from locality to locality. I don't think anyone would argue that women priests should be imposed in a culture where it would not be appropriate. But, this could be something that maybe only in Latin America, maybe only in North America. It is not a question of doctrine that has to be the same.
I agree with you. That's precisely what I'm trying to make, that it's not a universal concern. It's a universal concern, but perhaps it's greater in North America and in Western Europe than it is in other areas of the world.
Latin America, I think, really, is perhaps where it's greatest. Yeah.
But my concern is when I hear people speak of women leaving the church over this issue, hearing us laugh at statements made by the leaders of our church. I feel there's a time to criticize and that you have to promote your own views in certain manners. And it concerns me to hear people this morning speaking of the possibility that perhaps we will have to set up a parallel church to finally get women in their proper place in the church. And that this is happening in our church. And I would hope that those who confront the church and which is needed to be done, and those who differ in the views of papacy and of the leadership of the church on this issue will first and foremost make a commitment to the Catholic Church to remain in that church and to continue their struggle within the boundaries and with the confines that that brings with it. And I hope that our church will be able to weather the storm and perhaps come to a time when some kind of consensus is agreed upon. But I just would like to say that I do feel that men in the church and the leadership of the church are not shrugging off this issue and are struggling with it just as bravely as those here today.
Thank you.
Can I just say that I don't think I have spoken of a parallel church because you have not understood. I said we could make experience of churches, and I always said keeping in dialogue with, if you remember well. It is different from having a church parallel to another one. I would like to be understood in my speech.
Yes.
Okay. You said that your concern was women leaving your church if they can't find satisfaction in your own church. Does that concern prompt you to try to do something to change the way the church is now, so that those women who feel that the present church isn't adequate for their needs, so that those women won't feel the need to leave because the church will have changed to suit their needs? Do you feel the need to do that? And I would also like to say something else to something that you said, that the men would not shrug off responsibility for looking into the question. Are you saying then that you think that the leaders of the church are totally without prejudice, and that they are always reasonable, and that they always approach the question from a reasonable point of view? Because they are gospel.
Are there any other? Yes. May I say that I very much appreciate someone standing up in an audience like this one and making a point. I think it's important that we hear both sides, and I'm grateful that it was made. Sorry.
I think I've lost my nerve. First of all, I'd like to say that I'm not used to speaking in public, but I would like to address something to this young man, some of the experiences I have had growing up as a young person in Ireland in the Catholic Church. Some of the experiences have left me with a lot of anger, which now I'm trying to come to terms with. I remember a time when a young woman in Ireland, when she would have a baby, before she could go back to receive the sacrament, she would have to go back into the church and be churched. And I didn't understand what that meant. So I went to a priest and I asked him. And he said, because these young mothers who have given birth to a baby are considered unclean. I was absolutely horrified, and I said, well, where did that come from? I guess at that time I was a little ignorant about the Jewish tradition in the church. And he said it comes from the old Jewish tradition that, these people are unclean. Also, I couldn't put my foot on the altar simply and purely because I was a woman.
In the sanctuary, I mean.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
right up in the sanctuary.
Yeah.
I wasn't allowed to go in there. So this is just one or two of the experiences that I have had. And as I said today, it leaves me with a lot of angry feelings, but at the same time, I feel very optimistic that we have come a long way, and I hope that we keep on going. Thank you.
I also won't make any friends here.
that's true, and I never experienced it myself.
Excuse me. What I said was not that they weren't disadvantaged vis-a-vis men within the church. They obviously were. But they were not disadvantaged in the church in relation to their position in secular society. Those are two different kinds of comparative disadvantage.
Nothing else isn't really interested about all the other areas. It's concentrated to the sacrament position as a priest. But obvious it's really promoting.
I'd be very surprised if most of the women in the audience today weren't involved in a lot of the other ministries.
Probably all of them will say, I don't want to be a priest, but you're going straight to promoting just this position.
Well, certainly, yes. No, sorry.
Now, what is the difference if they don't want to be priests themselves?
Well, I have a daughter who is a lawyer. If she had not been allowed into law school, I would have been very vocal on the subject. I don't want to be a lawyer.
But, okay, also, it is just those people that say the ordination well, there is a shortage of priests. I think the other principle is that it's just those that say that it's shortage of priests, but it's those that want to be free that or when we put in every other thing, that's the of the church. Just those people also that let's say they have this the priest program, Toronto, it was for last year. Why? That was something that was going for priests. It has to be interfered in opposing it. It was said every other thing, all the other possibilities, why shouldn't be just for priesthood? Now, for instance, the billboard is just for priesthood. Everything, everybody else should be concerned. Now, if we are concerned of service to the Catholic people, now why does couldn't that have been left to them and the whole attention given to that? And why does the same people that are those, okay, let's say you said this was the following of the seminarians to train by.
Mm-hmm.
It would be extremely beneficial if it would get completely out and only priests would train in seminarians, because then it is
Okay, I'm
please, getting a little out of control. Please make your statement, make your question, and then that will be enough, please.
That it is those people, if the women train the seminarians, if you get, I'm often speaking here,
You've made several points that people could respond to, I think.
Yes, I think we could, if we could have a response to that, please, okay? Because you've raised a lot of, I think, interesting points.
Tom?
In terms of ministry and having ministers only trained by men, I think that would be a mistake. I've done a degree in theology, and I've had them as teachers. And also, you must remember that who are they going to minister to? I'm sure that over 50% of the population is going to be women, and it's already been in the church.
But I didn't finish off. I meant it is because they discourage the seminary. They bring to them. But I read.
No, I don't. I honestly don't think that's true. But perhaps some of the other points that you've made could be addressed, and then if there's time, you could make more. Yes.
I think these people are bringing up a point which, as not a Roman Catholic, as an outsider, I'm interested in hearing an answer to. I think these people are trying to express their faith as Catholics, the way I see it, in the infallibility of the Pope and in the infallibility of papal statements. Now, I'm interested in knowing how women with very good points and wanting to become more involved in the church can reconcile their faith to this belief in the infallibility of the papal statements.
I saw at least the man who spoke first shake his head that it wasn't a question of infallibility, but to your question, I don't think that since there have been no infallible statements on this position, I don't think the infallibility is a harder nut for a woman to crack than a man. I mean, in other words, I think that is a real problem for many Roman Catholics, but since there's certainly a high degree of authority in the statements, but no infallibility, I'm not sure that it really.
Well, perhaps I'm missing here. I understood that all statements in the Pope are infallible, but
No. No, I know. Unfortunately. Unfortunately, that is a misconception that's shared by all too many Roman Catholics. That's the trouble. But yes.
I just want to respond to the lady over here again as an outsider, but as an ordained person. I think that there is, and one feels called to that, there is a struggle with one's own perception of power and what that position will give you. But I think the task of priesthood is to go beyond that power and the gender differentiate and transform priesthood into something that you are called out of community. You're not just pronounced priest from on high. You're called out of community.
It does come from on high. It does come from on high of the church.
At the back there?
But that,
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry.
an understanding of authority, if coming down from on high is still male, then there's a negation of female experience within the body. I would really object to your thinking that women who go after priesthood simply want a mother God and a she priesthood. I think that's wrong. I think what they're saying is that we too are part of the community and as having experience in the world of God in a female sense and through female hearts and minds is important.
And thank you. Yeah.
And I'd just like to, as an ordained priest and pastor on this campus, I'd like to say that perhaps the great deficiency in my own education as a priest was somewhere in the area of the fact that I was trained only by priest. I think that my greatest education came afterwards, and not necessarily from priests. The system was a system which had a lot of inbreeding in it, and I always felt that I was lacking because of that. I don't think that the men who taught me my theology were necessarily in touch with the needs of the church and the needs of the world. They were professional priests who taught other priests theology and consequently did not, for the most part, stay in touch with everything else that was going around them, that was going on around them. I also think that sort of inbreeding has caused the struggle that we have in the church today, and I experienced that as campus minister, and that is that students find no relevance in the church around them. When they leave here, the greatest problem we have is that students say they have nothing out there, that their local churches are not in touch with reality. And I think part of that has to do with the leadership of their community, because it's from the leadership that the preaching comes. And the preaching has been inbred, and it has been very hierarchical, and it has not been in touch with the needs of people. And I'd just like to simply say that as a priest, I really feel, and I'm directing myself to the point that said that perhaps lay people should not instruct priests. I think that it's essential, absolutely essential, both men and women, to be part of our education.
Thank you. Okay. Yes. Well, and you know, something has to happen for the first time.
I feel very hurt when something missing to those that are saying they feel they're outsiders. Those that mention that I think there's something missing, I don't feel you are an outsider, or maybe I am if you feel that way.
I hope it didn't come from their experience here this morning.
The point about us laughing at certain points that are made, I think what was said earlier is that we're laughing rather than crying. And I can personally identify with that, though I could hear within these two people and others their experience and their feeling within them, and I accept that and I hear it. Except that I too have been laughed at and have put down because I'm lay and because I'm woman and because I don't have a degree. And that's okay, and maybe that's where my gifts have to come. But when working with people in parishes and in communities, in the parish community, I have seen men and women and youth and children who have gifts and who have leadership qualities and have businesses and are leading families and are growing in different areas and are illiterate in the church. And I even heard little specks here today of the unawareness of where we are in church today as far as our baptism and what that is and the heart of what it is in here in our experience. Also of what where the church is today in transition and even the spirit of the new hope. And I know like this much, just a smidgen at workshops here and there. But it's telling me when I hear little things here and there, how much I don't know, and then we don't know. We don't know as a people, and in the parishes it's even worse.
Yeah, I mean, we all experience this in different parishes to a different degree, but this is certainly true. But then this is what things like this morning and many other workshops are about, that we can all go back, you know, and bring it up that much. Oh, sorry, yes. I think we can take that for read, yeah.
But I find sometimes what happens is that, just we're lay people are more important, but we have our views which are different from, the big hierarchy. And they've had so many years of getting their arguments built up better and better to support what they want to say. And, they have their very strong arguments from the Bible. This is why women should be priests. And sometimes, when I get into the argument with someone who knows all these arguments, I don't know what to say back.
It's like arguing with a professional scientist if you're not a scientist. Yeah, I know. Well, I think what Elizabeth and I we're only, reflecting what's being said currently in Roman Catholic theology is we can trust our own experience. No, I don't mean it's infallible. I don't mean that we're never wrong. But the Spirit, Christ is present in His Spirit in the church. And so that when you get a voice that came, as I said, it's ironic that this is how the Assumption was defended, because it's very hard to find a biblical basis for the Assumption. So it was defended by the living faith of the people, the petition, you see. And, when you get this kind of groundswell, I'm not talking about any of us mounting our own private hobby horse and riding off, but, this kind of groundswell, which is then reinforced by conscientious and very, very hard-working theological reflection, then I think, there's a certain amount of confidence. Yes?
I think that all of us present here today have one great thing going for us, and that is that we believe in God. And God loves us. And as a Catholic, I've never had the experience personally to be called a priest. But I would like to say this: if I didn't have a loving mother and father, I wouldn't have love for God. And it was God through Christ who told us that we were loved, that we were just as good as anybody else in the community, a man as good as a woman. It was Christ who first recognized that women had souls. And that because we're experiencing growing pains in the church, I don't think there's any reason for fear that women are going to go out there and take over the world.
I agree.
These are growing pains,
Yeah.
and if we don't have this dialogue, both of us will be dwarfed, will suffer. We
Yeah.
won't understand what the love of God is. And if there is a future day when women are called, then God bless them, because they'll be carrying on the work of God, spreading His word, doing His good works. And I'm glad that we have an opportunity today to come here and say, well, we are Christians, and I believe that until women are duly recognized fully as daughters, children of God, the church will suffer.
I think, obviously people agree with you, and I think a point that Elizabeth made and that's implicit in what you said, men suffer too. This isn't, it's obviously in a different way, a different kind of suffering, but it will be a better church for both men and women. So I guess because you had a chance to speak last time. Yes?
The thing that I seem to find here is that God seems to be really left out. In the sense that we have a personal relationship with God. And when we're called to do something, we're called because God calls us. And so if a woman says, God has called me to be a priest, God has called me to serve, and somebody says, no, it hasn't, that doesn't make any sense, because that calling is a personal thing. And that denial seems to me very, very strange.
Well, may I comment on that? When men are called, when young men feel they have vocation and go to the seminary, what they call testing the vocation. It is, because they say it may be, we can be mistaken about ourselves. I may think I'm called to be a ballerina when I'm not, obviously. But the church has set up a whole process for testing the vocations of people who see themselves called. And I think precisely the argument of many, many women is that they experience this call and are not allowed to have it tested. You see, so, all I'm saying is I agree with what you're saying, but I want to make clear that there is a community dimension to it. And the community says, well, you may feel you're called, but let's see if we think you would represent us well.